The narcissist does not panic when the empath cries. They panic when the empath becomes calm. Because calmness means the manipulation has been understood. There comes a terrifying moment for every manipulator. The moment they realize the empath can now hear the hidden meaning behind every word, every silence, every fake apology. And once that happens, the entire illusion begins to collapse. If this message is speaking directly to an experience you have lived through, take a moment to subscribe and stay connected. Because understanding human behavior is not just knowledge, it is protection. And there are truths about emotional manipulation that most people only recognize after years of suffering. The narcissist fears awareness more than abandonment, because abandonment still allows them to protect the illusion they have created about themselves. If someone walks away while remaining emotionally confused, guilty, or heartbroken, the narcissist can continue believing they were the powerful one in the dynamic. They can reshape the story inside their mind, convincing themselves that the empath was unstable, overly emotional, or impossible to satisfy. But awareness is different. Awareness threatens the entire psychological structure they depend upon to survive emotionally. The narcissist carefully builds relationships around emotional control. They learn which words create guilt, which silences create anxiety, and which emotional inconsistencies keep the other person searching for validation. Much of their power comes not from strength, but from the other person's inability to clearly identify what is happening. Confusion becomes the atmosphere through which manipulation breathes. The empath constantly questions themselves instead of questioning the behavior directed toward them. But once awareness enters the relationship, the dynamic begins to crack. The empath starts noticing patterns that were once invisible. They recognize how accountability is avoided, how blame is redirected, and how emotional vulnerability is often used strategically rather than sincerely. They stop interpreting every conflict as proof of their own failure. This shift is deeply threatening because the narcissist can no longer operate from behind emotional camouflage. What terrifies the narcissist is not rejection itself, but exposure. Awareness exposes contradictions they worked hard to hide. It reveals that their charm may have been calculated, that their affection may have depended on control, and that their emotional reactions were often rooted in insecurity rather than love. Once the empath becomes conscious of these patterns, manipulation loses much of its psychological force. The narcissist senses this change immediately. The empath no longer reacts with panic, no longer over-explains, no longer chases approval after every emotional wound. Instead, there is observation, distance, discernment. The empath begins responding with clarity rather than emotional survival. And for someone who depends upon emotional dominance, clarity feels like the loss of power itself. This is why awareness becomes more frightening than abandonment. Abandonment can be rewritten into a story that protects the ego. But awareness creates a witness, and nothing is more dangerous to illusion than a person who finally sees clearly. The empath becomes dangerous once they stop reacting emotionally, because emotional reaction is the primary fuel that sustains manipulative dynamics. In the beginning, the empath often responds with openness, empathy, and an instinct to resolve tension quickly. They feel deeply responsible for emotional harmony, so every shift in tone, silence, or accusation creates an internal urgency to fix, explain, or repair. This responsiveness is exactly what allows manipulation to function, because the more the empath reacts, the more information the other person gains about their emotional triggers, boundaries, and insecurities. But something changes over time. After repeated cycles of confusion, blame, and emotional inconsistency, the empath begins to recognize that their reactions are being used rather than understood. They start noticing that every emotional response leads not to resolution, but to further distortion. Their explanations are twisted, their vulnerability is minimized, and their empathy is redirected against them. Slowly, the instinct to react begins to weaken. When the empath stops reacting emotionally, they are no longer feeding the cycle. They begin to pause instead of respond. They observe instead of absorb. This creates an immediate shift in the psychological structure of the relationship. What once relied on emotional volatility now meets stillness. And stillness cannot be easily manipulated because it offers no predictable emotional leverage. From the perspective of someone who relies on emotional control, this change feels threatening. The empath is no longer providing the expected reactions. No guilt, no panic, no emotional collapse, no desperate attempts to restore harmony. Without these responses, the usual strategies lose their effect. Attempts to provoke jealousy, confusion, or insecurity no longer land in the same way. The emotional hooks no longer catch. This is where the empath becomes psychologically dangerous to the manipulative dynamic. Not because they are aggressive or retaliatory, but because they are no longer readable in the same way. Their emotional transparency fades. The internal access that once made them predictable is replaced with awareness and restraint. In this state, the empath holds power, not through control over others, but through control over their own reactions. And in dynamics built on emotional dependency and reaction, a person who no longer reacts becomes impossible to steer, making the entire system lose its foundation. Manipulation depends on confusion and self-doubt, because these two internal states weaken a person's ability to trust their own perception of reality. When someone is confused, they begin to rely on external interpretation instead of their own instincts. They start asking themselves what something really meant, rather than recognizing what they directly experienced. This creates space for manipulation to enter, because where certainty is missing, influence takes control. Confusion in emotional dynamics often does not appear as something obvious. It builds gradually through mixed signals, inconsistent behavior, and emotional contradiction. One moment there is affection, the next there is distance. One moment there is reassurance, the next there is criticism disguised as concern. Over time, the mind struggles to form a stable pattern, and when patterns cannot be formed, the nervous system enters a state of tension and search. The person begins trying harder to understand, explain, and resolve what feels unresolved. This is where self-doubt is planted. When confusion persists, the individual begins to turn inward, assuming the problem must be their interpretation. They start questioning their emotional reactions, their sensitivity, and even their memory of events. This internal questioning shifts focus away from the behavior causing harm and redirects it toward the self. Instead of asking, "Why did they do that?" the mind starts asking, "Why did I react like that?" Or maybe I misunderstood. Once self-doubt is established, manipulation becomes easier to maintain because the person is now emotionally negotiating with themselves. They no longer fully trust their perception, so external explanations, no matter how inconsistent, begin to feel more authoritative than their internal experience. This allows controlling patterns to continue without being fully challenged. The deeper effect is psychological fragmentation. The person becomes split between what they feel and what they are told they should feel. This creates emotional instability, making them more likely to seek validation from the very source that is causing the confusion. Instead of stepping back, they move closer, hoping clarity will eventually come from the same environment that created the confusion in the first place. In this state, manipulation does not need force. It only needs inconsistency, because inconsistency keeps the mind searching, and a mind that is searching is easier to influence than a mind that is certain. Silence can become the empath's greatest form of power, because silence interrupts the emotional feedback loop that many controlling dynamics depend on. In relationships shaped by psychological tension, words are often used as tools of direction, correction, or emotional pressure. Responses are expected, reactions are measured, and emotional engagement becomes a way to maintain influence. When the empath is constantly explaining, defending, or reacting, they remain inside the system where control can still operate. But silence changes the structure completely. At first, it may be misunderstood as weakness or withdrawal, but over time it reveals something deeper. Silence removes access. It stops providing emotional material that can be used to provoke guilt, confusion, or reassurance seeking. Without words to interpret or reactions to analyze, the other person loses a key channel through which they used to understand and influence the empath's internal state. For the empath, silence is not emptiness. It becomes observation. Instead of entering emotional arguments or trying to correct distorted narratives, they begin to watch patterns without participating in them. This creates distance between stimulus and response. That distance is where clarity develops. What once felt urgent begins to lose emotional weight when it is no longer immediately engaged. From the perspective of someone who relies on emotional control, silence can feel unsettling because it removes predictability. Emotional reactions confirm connection, even if the connection is unstable or painful. Silence, however, does not confirm anything. It offers no reassurance, no resistance, and no emotional confirmation of power. This absence can feel more destabilizing than conflict, because conflict still maintains engagement, while silence does not. As the empath continues to hold silence, something important shifts internally. They stop over-explaining their boundaries. They stop defending their intentions against misinterpretation. They stop trying to convert misunderstanding into understanding. Instead, they allow actions to speak without interference. This reduces emotional exhaustion and restores inner stability. Silence also exposes intention. When reactions are no longer provided, behaviors become more visible in their raw form. Patterns that were previously hidden behind emotional chaos become easier to recognize. The empath begins to see not just what is being said, but what is being repeated. In this way, silence becomes more than absence of speech. It becomes a boundary without confrontation, a clarity without argument, and a form of strength that does not need to announce itself to be effective. Narcissists often mirror emotions they do not truly feel as a way to create connection, influence perception, and maintain emotional access without requiring genuine vulnerability. This mirroring is not always conscious in the dramatic sense people imagine, but it is adaptive. It allows them to reflect back what the other person expects to see, especially in the early stages of connection, when emotional trust is being formed. When they meet someone deeply empathetic, they quickly observe emotional language, how the person expresses care, what they respond to, what they fear losing, and what makes them feel understood. Then, instead of building emotional depth through shared experience, they replicate emotional signals that produce the desired effect. If warmth is needed, they become warm. If vulnerability is required, they present controlled vulnerability. If reassurance is expected, they offer it in precise timing. This creates the illusion of emotional alignment. The empath experiences what feels like deep resonance, believing they have found someone who naturally speaks their emotional language. However, what they are often experiencing is reflection rather than origin. The emotional expression is shaped around them, not necessarily generated from within the other person's inner world. Over time, this mirroring can shift depending on what maintains control or attachment. If closeness is needed, emotional intimacy is reflected. If distance is needed, detachment is reflected. This adaptability can make the dynamic feel intense and unpredictable because the emotional environment changes in response to perceived needs rather than consistent internal feeling. The deeper impact of this pattern is psychological confusion for the empath. Because the emotional responses appear real in the moment, they are interpreted as genuine connection. But inconsistencies begin to emerge later. The same depth is not always present. The same emotional availability appears conditional. This creates a sense of emotional instability where the empath keeps trying to recover the initial feeling of connection. Mirroring also serves another purpose. It reduces exposure. By reflecting, rather than revealing, the narcissist avoids full emotional transparency. Their inner emotional state remains partially hidden, while the empath becomes more open and self-disclosing. This creates an imbalance where one person is being seen clearly while the other remains emotionally obscured. In essence, emotional mirroring creates connection without equal depth, allowing attachment to form while maintaining control over how much of the true self is actually revealed. The empath's awakening destroys the old emotional dynamic because it interrupts the unconscious roles both people were playing inside the relationship. In the earlier stage of the dynamic, the empath often operates from a place of emotional responsibility, trying to understand, heal, and stabilize the connection, even when the other person is inconsistent or avoidant. This creates an invisible structure where one person overgives emotionally, while the other maintains control through unpredictability, distance, or selective warmth. When the empath begins to awaken, this structure starts to collapse from within. Awakening does not mean becoming cold or detached, but becoming aware of patterns that were previously invisible. The empath starts noticing repetition instead of randomness. They begin to see that emotional highs and lows are not accidental, but part of a cycle that keeps them emotionally engaged and internally unstable. This recognition alone is enough to disrupt the automatic nature of their responses. As awareness grows, the empath stops assigning personal meaning to every emotional shift. They no longer interpret distance as something they must fix, or interpret emotional confusion as something they must solve. Instead of reacting immediately, they begin to observe. This pause between feeling and reaction is where the old dynamic begins to lose its structure. The emotional system that once depended on the empath's constant engagement begins to weaken. The usual triggers no longer produce the same intensity of response. Attempts to recreate confusion, urgency, or emotional dependence become less effective because the empath is no longer fully immersed in the experience. They are partially outside it, watching it unfold rather than being absorbed by it. This shift changes the entire balance. The empath is no longer purely reactive, and the dynamic can no longer rely on unconscious participation. What was once automatic now requires effort to sustain. Emotional games that depended on unpredictability begin to lose impact because they are being seen rather than blindly experienced. At the same time, the empath begins reclaiming internal space that was previously occupied by emotional overanalysis of the relationship. Their attention returns to themselves, their boundaries, and their own emotional clarity. This reduces dependency on external validation and weakens the pull of old patterns. The destruction of the old dynamic is not loud or dramatic. It happens quietly through awareness replacing confusion and presence replacing emotional entanglement. Boundaries expose hidden control mechanisms because they introduce a structure where emotional access is no longer automatic, but conditional. In dynamics where one person has been used to emotional flexibility, where forgiveness is quick, explanations are constant, and access is always available, boundaries create an immediate disruption. They turn what was once assumed into something that must now be respected. At first, boundaries may be misunderstood or resisted. This happens because they remove the familiar flow of emotional responsiveness. When someone says no, pauses communication, or refuses to engage in circular emotional conversations, it interrupts the system that relied on continuous access. The reaction that follows often reveals more about the dynamic than the boundary itself. Frustration, guilt-tripping, withdrawal, or sudden emotional intensity can appear when control is no longer effortless. This is where hidden mechanisms become visible. Control does not always appear as direct domination. It often appears as subtle pressure to abandon one's own limits for the sake of harmony. When boundaries are set, these subtle pressures surface. The empath begins to see patterns such as emotional reversal, where they are made to feel responsible for enforcing limits, or emotional escalation, where calm boundaries are met with heightened reactions designed to overwhelm them. Boundaries also reveal dependency structures. If someone is comfortable with healthy emotional exchange, a boundary is accepted as part of individuality. But if the dynamic depends on emotional access, the boundary feels like a threat. This difference exposes whether the connection is based on mutual respect or emotional entitlement. For the empath, setting boundaries is often accompanied by discomfort at first, because it goes against their instinct to maintain harmony. However, over time, they begin to notice something important. Clarity replaces confusion. Instead of constantly adapting to emotional shifts, they begin to observe how others respond when they are no longer endlessly available. This observation is crucial. It shows whether the other person can engage with respect or only with access. It reveals whether connection is based on mutual understanding or on emotional leverage. As boundaries stabilize, the empath becomes less reactive to pressure and more anchored in self-definition. The emotional environment changes because access is no longer guaranteed, and anything that depended on unlimited access begins to lose influence. Self-respect is the final stage of emotional liberation, because it replaces emotional survival patterns with internal authority. In earlier stages of the dynamic, the empath often operates from external orientation, meaning their emotional stability is tied to how others respond to them. Approval feels like safety, misunderstanding feels like threat, and emotional inconsistency creates internal urgency to restore balance. This keeps them locked in cycles of over-explaining, over-giving, and self-questioning. But as awareness grows, something fundamental shifts. The empath begins to recognize that not every emotional imbalance requires their participation. They stop treating every disruption as something they must repair. Instead of constantly adjusting themselves to maintain connection, they begin to evaluate whether the connection itself is healthy, reciprocal, and emotionally safe. Self-respect emerges when the empath starts prioritizing their internal experience over external validation. This does not mean shutting down emotion, but honoring it without negotiation. They begin to trust their perception again, especially in moments where they were previously conditioned to doubt themselves. This rebuilding of self-trust is crucial, because manipulation thrives where self-doubt exists. With self-respect in place, emotional decisions change. The empath no longer stays in situations simply because they understand the other person's pain. They no longer confuse empathy with self-sacrifice. They begin to see that understanding someone does not require enduring emotional harm from them. This distinction marks a major psychological shift. At this stage, emotional access is no longer automatic. It becomes something that must align with mutual respect and consistency. If it does not, the empath is able to disengage without collapsing into guilt or confusion. This ability to disengage without internal chaos is one of the clearest signs of emotional liberation. Self-respect also stabilizes perception. The empath is no longer easily pulled into distorted narratives because they have an internal reference point that remains steady. Instead of constantly recalibrating themselves based on external emotional pressure, they evaluate experiences through clarity and consistency. Ultimately, self-respect changes the entire emotional landscape. What once felt like a cycle of attachment and confusion becomes a space of discernment and choice. The empath is no longer driven by the need to be understood at any cost, but by the commitment to remain aligned with their own emotional truth.